On today's World Insight, our special program, Alaska Calling. The China-U.S. high-level talks have put Alaska front and center. We speak to experts in China-U.S. ties to see if the frosty start to talks can thaw towards compromise. And we speak to two Alaskans who have witnessed firsthand China's integral role in their state's economy and livelihoods. Can they relay this message to their fellow Americans? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, our special program, Alaska Calling. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with a highly anticipated meeting between Chinese and U.S. top diplomats in the Alaskan city of Anchorage. These are the first high-level, in-person, bilateral talks since Biden took office, and they got off to a fiery start on Thursday. The opening remarks in front of journalists were said to be scheduled for a few minutes, but ended up lasting almost an hour. In a rare display, both sides shed diplomatic tones and leveled sharp rebukes of the other's policies.
Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability.
在一些地区的问题
In regards to some regional issues, I think the issue is that the U.S. relies heavily on its military and financial hegemony to maintain its long-arm jurisdiction against some countries by using the so-called notion of national security to suppress and hamper normal trade transactions, as well as provoking other countries to launch offensives against China.
正常的贸易往来，而且煽动一些国家 对中国进行攻击。
The U.S. side opened the meeting with a tough stance by accusing China on issues regarding Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. China's top foreign affairs leader Yang Jiechi responded with a 15-minute speech in Chinese, rebuking the aggressive American position. Both sides accused the other of violating diplomatic protocol. And take a look at all of these. The highly unusually extended back and forth in front of the camera has drawn certainly great interest on social media from both countries and beyond. In front of cameras, the atmosphere seems to be tense, but Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi says that behind closed doors, both sides laid out their positions and engaged in very productive talks. The two sides have now finished 2 sessions already, while a third session of talks was scheduled for Friday morning. And for more on the Alaska talks, we are joined in Wyoming, United States. Robert Ross, the associate at the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. Good to see you. And also in New Orleans, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, professor of politics at East Asia Normal University in Shanghai. Last but not least, in Beijing, via phone, we have Yuan Peng, who is the president of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Great to see and hear from all of you, gentlemen. What a day. I want to start by asking Professor Yuan Peng, what is your take of the exchange of barbs, as the media put it, for the very first session in the series of talks between U.S. and China? Professor Yuan, your take.
Oh, yes. It's a very unique, very unprecedented. And even if before they began to talk, many media predicted should be very tough in conversation. But still, the several minutes opening remarks lasted so long, and the very tough stand in each side still unprecedented. I think maybe it's a real picture of the relations today. So both sides admitted that the relations in a very serious competition. So maybe it's a good thing that both sides present its own stance, representing its own national interests. This is what's the real picture of the relations. But on other side, I should say from Chinese perspective, I should say American side this time shows a little bit impolite and unfriendly in the first round, because you are the guests. You are the hosts. We Chinese are the guests. We fly a long journey to Alaska to show our sincerity, want to manage the relations, want to resolve problems.
Yeah.
So as the guests, you should not just repeat all those old rhetoric like Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, sort of things, and blaming on China. And before that, you just have a Quad dialogue. You visited Japan and South Korea. Seems that you already set this very framework in advance, so that to shape China in Americans frame. I think this is we Chinese side at this time State Councilor Wang and Director Yang, I think to show very sincerity. I hope in the next round maybe both sides should be in a more polite attitudes.
Well, very interesting opening certainly for the first session, but the second session already wrapped up. So Mr. Ross, I'm sure you are also watching from Wyoming very closely. You are familiar with 4 of them, both the American and the Chinese side.
Yes, I have to say I'm quite disappointed and quite saddened by the beginning of our first dialogue in U.S.-China relations under the Biden administration. For those of us who worked so hard over the years, myself, Yuan Peng, and others, to promote U.S.-China cooperation understanding, this is the worst I can imagine the relationship has been since Henry Kissinger visited China in 1971. It's unfortunate. Many of us might agree with some of the statements by the Biden administration, but it doesn't establish a good foundation to negotiate and reach understandings when, as observed, sanctions are placed on Chinese officials days before meetings. You go around the region trying to present a united front to coerce China to compromise. You accuse China and implicitly its leadership of genocide, and then you expect China to have a welcome, warm greeting. I think this is something of a fiasco. I think going forward, we're going to have a very difficult situation, and I'm not optimistic. The United States, when it says it wants to cooperate with China, mentions really what they're saying is we want China to cooperate with American interests, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in North Korea, whether it's in climate change. But I've yet to hear the Americans discuss Chinese interests, and on the contrary, the United States seem intent on escalating tension in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. The United States seems to have a perspective on American power, which is somewhat antiquated in terms of its relationship to China. And we have a new relationship with China. However much you may disagree with China on many things, whether it's domestic politics, whether it's international politics, cooperation requires some degree of respect and some degree of moderation of one's own feelings to promote an agenda. We haven't seen this yet in the United States.
I see. Professor Mahoney, I also want to have your opinion as well.
Well, a lot of times these meetings are somewhat choreographed, and these 2 diplomats from China, they're very savvy, they're very experienced. I'm sure they didn't walk into a trap. They seem well prepared for the response. I think it's good for both sides to share their honest feelings. But to a large extent, I think we understand that the Biden administration is posturing for its domestic critics. And it is trying to position itself to gain some leverage in talks. But I think the real concern here, and I have some optimism and some pessimism, is that we had this old term in China of the United States following a two-handed approach, towards China, one hand extended in greeting, the other pulled back in a fist. I think what we're seeing in the Biden administration is kind of a three-handed Frankenstein. There's an effort for, or a call for cooperation, but also a call for competition, and also clearly some efforts to contain. So I think from the Washington perspective, this looks like pragmatism, but I think it also looks like Biden is playing chicken with his domestic critics, and it's not yet clear whether or not this is going to offer a viable foreign policy, or whether it risks collapsing in its own contradictions,
That's the thing.
especially above all if China refuses to play along.
That's the thing. I mean, all these posturing, whatever you want to name it, whether it really serves the U.S. interests at all, not to mention the collective interests, both U.S. and China, because there are collective interests. And on that, I have also from Shanghai, Professor Shending Li from the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University. Professor Shen, your comments. Professor Shen.
Suggest that there are, yes, can you hear me?
Go ahead, sir.
I think both U.S. and China have agreed that we should cooperate wherever we can cooperate. So U.S. want to cooperate, China wants to cooperate, but the U.S. also say U.S. would confront with China wherever it must confront. And China want to have a list management with the U.S. to minimize those contents of disagreement. So if the two countries would cooperate wherever they can cooperate and also would agree to disagree, I think I'm still hopeful for the day two of the, such a level of dialogue, because they are going to have another day of dialogue.
Right. Let's just focus on the second round of dialogue, because it's not just the fiery exchanges, which the media picked up, but the real thing going on for the second dialogue. After the second round, Chinese State Council Foreign Minister Wang Yi, answering very briefly remarks from the media, he said it's actually exchange opinions about regional issues. Now, that's a very important clue. What is going on? Professor Yuan Peng, help us to understand what might be some of the regional issues. Would that bring the two sides together?
Round should be more constructive talking, because the first round focused on too much on its political stand on each side. It's quite understandable. But the second round, I hope, at least the American side should go beyond the domestic political driven attitudes, because we once expected that Biden administration should show some differences in its China policy from Trump administration. We call it a window of opportunity. But if too much focus on domestic, too much driven by domestic politics, too much led by the so-called old story, the human rights, Hong Kong, Taiwan, rather than ignoring the common problems like COVID-19, economic recovery, regional challenges, and the climate changes, I think is unconstructive. So I hope after the first round rebuild on domestic political stand, the second round we are back to resolving those real common challenges, and also mutually understanding its domestic agenda in each side, and also focus on bilateral relations. That is what we want to expect.
Right. So, Mr. Ross, so let's have some sophisticated talk. That seems to be the focus of second round, regional issues. Can something achieved for the first time talk on the regional issues? What's likely to be the foundation, if it's a good one, to be laid here?
Let's be clear, there are three regional issues. There is for the United States, the North Korea problem, and for China, there's the Taiwan issue, and then there's the South China Sea. The Americans want Chinese help on North Korea, but until the United States is prepared to negotiate mutual concessions with North Korea, conduct reciprocity, consider lifting sanctions, neither the Chinese nor the South Koreans are going to support American policy. On the Taiwan Strait, let's be clear now, since the administration has come into power within the last 2 months, the number of U.S. transits of military ships through the Taiwan Strait have increased. Arms sales have taken place and licensing has taken place. We've seen no U.S. interest thus far in trying to reduce the tension, I might say, despite some signals of Chinese goodwill. And in the South China Sea, the situation is similar. We've seen an escalation of U.S. presence. It seems the United States is not prepared to make the concessions necessary to signal or I shouldn't say concessions, make the adjustments necessary to ratchet down the tension.
Okay.
I've seen nothing to suggest that the two sides were prepared to have some reciprocity to reach a mutual reduction of tensions. I think this meeting today is the second meeting is primarily focused on laying down positions, which at this point on these three regional issues are totally contradictory to each other.
I see.
It's going to be a long time before the United States can begin to ratchet down its high-level diplomacy that has pressured China and to retreat to a more constructive position. That will be difficult to do. Yes, perhaps we've done much of this for domestic politics, but in overplaying your hand in domestic politics, you've undermined the prospects for cooperation. And then if you want to improve cooperation by reducing your hostile posture, then now you open yourself up even more for domestic criticism, for seemingly backing down in face of Chinese pressure.
Got your
the
point.
administration's in a terrible position right now.
Got your point. It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Professor Shen,
Yes,
I know.
it is.
Yeah, I know you guys are very familiar with one another. You've been doing research and debate about China-U.S. relations for decades. Tell me your take on this. With quite a dramatic opening, will the two sides be able to at least achieve something in terms of what many have hoped, at least a beginning?
Yes, I do believe the two countries have genuine intent to achieve something. And because the U.S. has made it very clear, cooperate wherever the two countries can. And apparently, U.S., China supporting WHO to make WHO to play a central role in navigating the world free from pandemic. This is the common interest of U.S. and China. China-U.S. may not cooperate directly, but they could cooperate under the framework of WHO. And for North Korea, U.S. would appreciate China if the DPRK would shoot some long-range missile test, conducting another nuclear weapon detonation. And the U.S. need China to work on this. And U.S. and China are against those open de jure independence of Taiwan. So I think the two countries share lots of interest, though they retain lots of difference. I do hope for this categorized talk, the list of cooperation, the two countries would deliver something for us to see.
The world is watching. Actually, there are responsibilities on both sides to be able to deliver something, to answer the concern of the world. Professor Mahoney, your take, briefly. Regional issues, and also what's next for the third round.
Yeah, I think that...
Go ahead.
Yeah, clearly the biggest, stickiest issue is Taiwan. I expect that they're coming to a tacit agreement on how to better manage tension with Taiwan and the South China Sea. The real question is going to be whether or not the Biden administration, like previous administrations before the Trump administration, will play a role in disciplining Taiwan to keep the separatist or the independence movement there in check. The biggest question is the economy. Biden won't say it directly, but the U.S. really needs a lot of economic help. His high-risk stimulus package is going to need to resolve this trade war one way or the other. I don't think we're going to see much movement on the tech war. We might see some supply chain exceptions to keep production moving, but the United States is likely moving in the direction of a national industrial policy, so that's where we're going to see competition. But the one thing that we haven't heard the others mention is Myanmar. There's some talk about maybe some cooperation there. I don't see that yet, and I don't think that North Korea is really in the discussion here. I think it's really about Taiwan. I think North Korea is doing its own thing.
All right. There are a lot of things going on, certainly behind the doors, that would be the topic for many of us for days and probably months to come. We're going to continue with our discussion with all of you, Shending Li, Joseph Mahoney, Yuan Peng, and Robert Ross. We're in between, we're going to have some interviews coming from Alaska, talking to the real people in Alaska, listening to what they have to say. And this is Alaska Calling. a special program of World Insight with me, Tian Wei. As China and U.S. officials continue their talks in Anchorage, Alaska, how will people from Alaska perceive this meeting? I talked to Wesley Early, who's a news director at KOTZ in Kotzebue, Alaska. He had previously covered Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Alaska back in 2017. Before that, he even spent time in Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, Xi'an, Wuhan when he was a student in the University of Alaska. As a keen observer of China-U.S. ties, Early believes the two sides need to have genuine talks to solve their differences. Let's listen to my brief interview with him. Leslie Early, what a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Tian Wei. Thank you for inviting me.
You know how I find you?
You know, I don't know how much overlap there is between Alaska and China, so, you know, I'm kind of surprised anybody has found any of the old articles I wrote when I was in college.
Yes, I found that postcard article you wrote when you were making your trip years ago in China as a student of University of Alaska.
Right. It was kind of... It wasn't exactly an exchange program because we weren't getting Chinese students to come to Alaska. It was more of a kind of like a 2-week immersion program. Mm-hmm. And so we traveled to Beijing, Xi'an, Chongqing, Wuhan, down the Yangtze River, and we ended in Shanghai. So it was I was there mainly as as funny as it sounds, I was there mainly as a translator because
Really?
I took, yeah, I had taken 3 years of Mandarin in high school.
How is that trip helping you, you know, even today to navigate what's going on and how you could, as a journalist, approach that story? I think my experience helped me a lot, you know, living in a different culture.
Yeah, I think that it definitely shows how much we don't know about China, but how much China knows about the United States. Like in Shanghai, for instance, like most of the people spoke English who I interacted with, you know, students at the Wuhan Agricultural University said that their favorite show was Desperate Housewives, which is a TV show from like 15 years ago. You know, they were very on the up and up about American culture. And because I got to see a lot of China, I got to see, you know, to me, there were 3 different like types of cities. There were like the very developed cities. So like China, like Shanghai and Beijing. There were cities that were developing. So a lot of construction, you know, you could definitely see that people were starting to move to these big cities. Mm-hmm. Xi'an really made me think like that. And then, you know, as we're on the train, from Beijing to Xi'an, you definitely see like farmland, you know, and how a lot of China is really rural. You know, China is as diverse as the United States is.
Now you are a news director of the local public radio station in Alaska. So I'm sure you are encountering stories about China-U.S. talk in Alaska taking place in Anchorage.
Yeah, you know, these aren't anything new. The president of China actually had come to Anchorage a few years ago when I lived in Anchorage, and I covered his visit. He had met with the governor of Alaska at the time. His name was Bill Walker. One of the big discussions that Walker wanted to have was on the prospect of a natural gas line in Alaska and possibly, you know, providing liquefied natural gas to Chinese consumers. I know that was a big thing he wanted to do.
You know, I'm sure you heard a little bit through the wire services about what's going on during the first day of discussion between China and the U.S. delegation in Anchorage. Both you and I are not political decision makers, but, you know, even as journalists, we think about them, how they would articulate the situation and how we would, as a journalist, report about possibly the next stage, right?
Which, you know, there's been a lot of really, really negative rhetoric in the United States. And as we've seen in the country over the last, you know, few months, but very, very recently, you know, yesterday there was an attack in Atlanta, Georgia on Asian Americans. And it's really highlighting a lot of violence towards Asian Americans. And I think that a lot of this sort of nasty rhetoric contributes to that, right? And when we talk about China, it's always in an adversarial way. And part of that is because, you know, the United States and China compete economically. I think that it's about creating a situation where in goodwill, right? Yes. In good faith, where people can negotiate and talk about, who does what in the scheme of like global economics, right? It's not just, what is the United States doing for people who live in America? Because, if you're just thinking about, how is this going to affect American jobs, and you're not thinking about how it's going to affect Americans, who buy things, Americans who want to travel, all sorts of things that China and the United States, sort of all of the places where China and the U.S. overlap, I think that you don't get a lot of nuance. Like you mentioned earlier, as journalists, we're not political move makers, but we have to know what they're doing because we have to tell other people what they're doing. So
exactly.
we're very dialed in, and we as Americans aren't always 100% clear as to what China is like. And to us, China is just a country in the world, right? We don't really think about it. And because so much of it is painted in this sort of antagonistic manner where it's like it's China versus the United States, I think a lot of people just kind of automatically assume that the position has to be sort of animus, but I don't think that's true.
My final question, now looking back at your own postcard stories, years after that, do you think the world has changed a lot?
When I went there, I thought, wow, I didn't even think about China as a massive market for Alaska salmon, right? Or I never thought of how important U.S. soy production is for China. We got to visit the United States soy consulate in Shanghai, and we learned about how soy is a major farming product in the United States, and China's buying a lot of it, right?
Yes.
We don't really hear about that. We don't hear about how China's really boosting the careers of soy farmers, but that's, all we hear is that, China's competing with us, and trips like the one that I took, they help people by showing them just like what is different in the world, that I think, I'm going to remember parts of my trip to China for the rest of my life, and I was only there for a couple of weeks.
I'm going to remember our conversation, by the way, Leslie. I hope our conversation will continue for the years to come.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
Wesley Early, that's a news director coming from a local radio station in Alaska when the bilateral talks between China and the United States are taking place exactly there in the city of Anchorage. So now let's come back to the expert's view. You are watching our special program, Alaska Calling of World Insight, with me, Tian Wei. So is there any hope for China and the United States to reach a consensus? For more on that, we are still joined by Robert Ross, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Shending Li, and Yuan Peng later on the phone. We have about 6 minutes left for our conversation this part. What I really want to ask is, what do you advise both sides to do for the third round, which is likely to be the last round according to the original schedule? Mr. Ross, I go to you. You never disappoint me. Tell me, what is your advice for both sides?
I think there needs to be some effort to come out of this meeting with something positive. It's not going to be a regional issue. It's not going to be an agreement on trade. But if we can simply say, given the importance of the U.S.-China relationship, we want to establish a regularized official dialogue for periodic meetings to discuss regional issues, trade issues, and going forward, we will soon schedule our first meeting. That would be a major accomplishment. Simply to say, we're going to now talk and try and negotiate agreements for mutual interest. And then between now, if we can do this, and that first meeting, both sides just silence themselves on all the issues that have been hot-button issues for the last 2 months to restore some calm to the relationship so we can move forward.
I see. Professor Yuan Peng is also joining us on the phone. Professor Yuan Peng, this last round, what needs to be done urgently?
Most urgently for me to say is that, first of all, both sides should set the bottom line of the relations. That is, from American side, don't do something more harmful on people-to-people exchanges, on dealing with some sanctions against Chinese high-rank officials. Those is very very bad things should stop. I think it's the bottom line of the relations. And secondly, it's the red line, in particular in Taiwan issue. I think one China policy is the cornerstone of the relations for more than 40 years, but now is seriously damaged. So we need to reaffirm that one China policy should be the core of the relations. And then beyond that, we should have the new code of conduct in dealing with every aspect of the relations. We don't expect these dialogues can resolve something very radically, but we need to have some rule-based on the relations.
Okay. And Professor Mahoney, your take.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is clearly they need to understand each other's red lines. What I would really like to see is at least a statement that they're going to have more meetings, and above all that they have discussed in real tangible ways how to avoid escalating conflict, to at least put that on pause so that we're not dealing constantly with the hot button issues, so that we can focus more directly on some of the issues that a lot of people care about, COVID, the pandemic, economic recovery, and climate change.
Right. Well, Professor Shunding Li, your take, your turn.
Both China and U.S. need to deliver the deliverable, including reopening the consulates in Houston and in Chengdu, and to help increase the people-to-people exchange. At this time, U.S. has stopped from July the 1st last year the issuance of J visa for academic visit. Of course, during the COVID time, no one would visit. But with the availability of vaccine, more visits would be necessary and would be possible. But by stopping issue any single visa, China-U.S. academic exchange has stopped. This is totally unhealthy. Even if U.S. and the Soviet Union was at the peak time of Cold War, these two countries had academic exchange. And the China-U.S. relations are far better than the former Cold War relations between Moscow and Washington. And what about the summit meeting between the two countries on the TV screen, based on the Lunar New Year Eve phone conversation between the two presidents? They need to meet and talk. They used to meet as a vice president. Now, as the president of the country, they need to assure to each other how to improve. And by designing through this Anchorage dialogue, some tangible things for the two presidents to announce.
Okay. Well, bottom lines, red lines, deliverables, and also code of conduct. There are many tasks on both sides. We hope they're not going to disappoint us, but rather be able to work collectively, because the four of you, at least the gentlemen, I have to say, have been working collectively with different perspectives. Robert Ross, Joseph Mahoney, Yuan Peng, Shunding Li, what a pleasure, and thank you so much. Alaska Calling, our special program of World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The eyes of the world are on Alaska for the first in-person dialogue between China and the United States. The meeting point, Anchorage, is roughly halfway between Beijing and Washington. China is Alaska's top trading partner, as the nation is the world's largest importer of natural resource commodities. The fastest growth period for Alaska's export shipments to China, dubbed the Dragon Decade, was between 2000 and 2011, when export value soared from $100 million to almost $1.5 billion. Earlier, I had the chance to walk with and talk with Greg Wolf, Executive Director of the World Trade Center, Anchorage, who called the relationship between China and the United States, particularly Alaska, ties between the Middle Kingdom and the Great Land. Let's listen in. I'm joined by Greg Wolf, Executive Director of the World Trade Center Anchorage. He's also the founder of Alaska-China Business Conference. Good to see you, Greg. Tell me more about how you've been, working on this issue. When did it start?
My interest in China really started back in the early 1990s. At that point, I could see so many opportunities for Alaska to be part of China's economic progress. China needed everything that Alaska has to offer in terms of natural resources to build infrastructure and to build a modern economy.
And now things have changed a little bit. What does that mean, Greg?
The economic growth of China has been very good news for Alaska. We've been part of it. We continue to be part of it. And let me give you an example. In the year 2000, our exports from Alaska to China were very small, about $100 million. Just 10 years later, our exports were $1.4 billion.
Wow.
We call this 10-year period the Dragon Decade.
That's a good way to address it.
Because of the rapid growth.
Yes.
We had growth in other markets in Asia, for example, but no country grew so fast and to such a high level as we have experienced with the trade relationship we have with China.
There are a lot of talks about, the U.S. has a lot of priority to deal with, pandemic and many other things, and therefore cannot focus that much on China-U.S. relations. But others argue, like you, say this should be the priority because our community is being influenced. What do you make of these two arguments?
The United States and China and the whole world has had to deal with the global pandemic of the coronavirus. But in terms of the trade situation between our two countries, I've been involved in international trade for more than 30 years. And in my experience, there is no winner with a tariff war. I think it's sort of a lose-lose situation. It's not beneficial to the business community and the consumers of China, and it's not beneficial to the business community and consumers of the United States. So I'm surprised that this tariff situation has gone on for as long as it has, and I'm hoping we have a chance to restart. We have a new administration here, under President Biden.
Right.
And there's this first in-person meeting taking place in Anchorage between senior foreign policy leaders of both countries. I try to be optimistic. I know it takes time for change to happen, but I'm hopeful that this meeting in Anchorage might be the start of a sort of reset, another chance to restart the trade relationship on a more positive note.
What kind of reset you want to see?
So I'm hoping that we can have a different tone. We can sort of cool down the temperature between the two countries and find things that we agree on. Find some grounds that we can agree on and work on together.
Yeah.
And then maybe it might set the stage or set the foundation to make other changes to bring sort of trade normalization back to where business people on both sides can make business-based decisions and not have to worry about things like tariffs and other trade restrictions.
I see. A lot of people have been joking about this. First of all, Alaska, Anchorage, what a great place to meet. It's both meeting halfway, isn't it, in terms of distance?
Yeah.
And it's also a cool place, really cool place, right? Cold right now, so everybody can cool down right now.
Yeah. So maybe everyone will cool down. Good point. Today was a beautiful sunny day, but a little bit cold. You're right. Exactly. It's exactly halfway. It's almost exactly halfway between Washington D.C. and Beijing.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, that location, that midpoint location between Asia and the continental United States is why the Anchorage International Airport is one of the top 5 airports in the world for air cargo, for the movement of cargo. And in the case of Anchorage, a lot of that traffic going back and forth across the Pacific, much of it heading toward China and from China, is what's driving the growth of our airport.
I know the Chinese team have been preparing much, both having their vaccines in order to travel and also to prepare for the winter wardrobe. If you give us some advice, one day ahead to them, what would they wear and what do they need to carry? What are some of the necessities? What would you say, Greg?
Well, I think if they come in the summer, we have a very beautiful summer. It will be fairly cool compared to, say, Beijing, or even Shanghai. But in the summer, like June, July, and August are very beautiful, cool temperature for you. The winter, if you like the snow and ice and mountains and being outdoors and seeing wildlife like moose and bears, I sometimes have a moose in my own yard, even in my own backyard. It's just walking around and they're not afraid of anyone.
What a pleasure. Greg Wolf, Executive Director of the World Trade Center Anchorage and also founder of Alaska-China Business Conference. Thank you so much. All the best. And that's all we have for today's special Alaska Calling, a World Insight special on the latest talk between China and the United States. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching and bye for now.